So I wanted to start out by thanking Jan for inviting me to speak here today. I defended my dissertation just a few months ago, so this is it's given me the opportunity to try to think beyond my doctorate, which is both helpful and a bit scary, I think. So during the last year of my doctorate, I became especially interested in the question of the constitutional heterogeneity of the EU member states, by which I mean that the EU member states have developed along quite different constitutional paths, but also that they belong to radically different constitutional imaginaries. So, by which I mean that basically they think about the constitution of public authority in very different ways. They think about the foundations of public authority in very different ways. So there's no agreement, I would say, between the EU member states in how they think about what a constitution is and does. And there are historical reasons for that. So if we agree that constitutions have a world-making capacity, the worlds created and sustained around the constitutions of the EU member states are quite diverse. So that's of course not to say that there are no shared ideas across the different constitutional imaginaries of the member states as well as the EU treaties. So one of the most prominent and important of these ideas is that of democracy, which is prominently displayed both in the preamble and in Article 2. But I would argue that within the different constitutional imaginaries of the EU member states, democracy does not mean the same thing. Democracy is imagined as a fundamentally different kind of political and institutional relationship or principle, however you want it, within the different EU member states. And in this paper, I have tried to sort of develop or sketch out three different ideal types of constitutional imagination of the EU member states, each of them having a radically different conception of what democracy means. So the first ideal type is what I call post-fascist constitutionalism or constrained democracy. And I believe it will be well known to all of you because it's arguably the most sort of prominent and widespread and well-known ideal type of constitutionalism of the EU member states and of the EU as such. So within this constitutional imagination, the constitutional regime is born out of a fear of the internal collapse of the legal and political order. So for the original 6 member states, with France as a possible exception, this is manifest in the traumatic experiences of the rise of fascism and Nazism in the interwar period that culminated in World War II. But a similar story can be told for Spain with the Franco regime, for Portugal with the Salazar regime, and for Greece with the dictatorship of the regime of the colonels. So in this post-fascist constitutional imagination, constitutional authority is born out of a fear of the destructive potentials of popular sovereignty and the political power of the masses. So it's this fear of the people which is at the origins of the constitutional order. And the post-fascist constitutions are created in order to constrain or neutralize the power of the people. So for that reason, it's been called constrained democracy or militant democracy by people like Jan Werner Müller. So despite still speaking in the language of we the people, the constituent power of the people is perceived as something very dangerous that ought to be constrained. And the post-fascist constitutional order is sort of deployed by the state as an instrument of law to either eradicate or radically limit the political power of the people. So it's a fundamentally anti-revolutionary form of constitutionalism. The post-fascist constitutions are elite constructions that, in the words of Hannah Arendt, were written by experts as pudding made from recipe. So in order to constrain the political power of the people or the masses, the post-fascist constitutions make use of a lot of different governmental techniques, such as ban of anti-constitutional parties, strengthening of counter-majoritarian institutions, abolition or restriction of populist institutions. But there's also this limitation of extraordinary politics that I already mentioned, which is sort of like this idea of the constituent power. So this is done importantly by bringing the question of constitutional questions and questions of the constituent power within the scope of judicial review. So within the post-fascist constitution, there's no such thing as a political question, doctrine, because all constitutional questions are understood as being able to be addressed as legal questions, because the constitution is understood as fundamentally as a legal order rather than a political order. So this is a highly formalized, legalized and depoliticized understanding of democracy, where the constitutional court is the sole guardian of the constitution. Okay. So there are other visions of constitutionalism of the EU member states, and one of them that I describe is this vision of evolutionary constitutionalism or parliamentary democracy. So that applies to the UK and to Sweden and Denmark. And within these three states, the dominant form of constitutionalism is not post-fascist constitutionalism, and democracy is not envisioned as constrained democracy. So evolutionary constitutionalism, I think the crucial point is not based on a fear of the people. Rather, democracy is still envisioned as it was in the post-Second World War era, as parliamentary government. And the central reason for this lack of the fear of the people in the constitutional imagination of the parliamentary democracies is the absence of a complete legal and political breakdown during the interwar period and the World War II. So if anything, the Second World War sort of confirmed the belief in civil society as a benign power and parliamentary democracy as an authentic expression of democracy, of the political power of the people. And for that reason, World War II and the interwar period did not lead to a foundation of a new type of constitutional imagination for these states. Democracy was understood as having persevered, and the constitutional order was interpreted as an unbroken tradition. Okay, so within this vision, the parliamentary democracies, they have a material and a political conception of their constitutions. And to the extent there's one, the written constitution is understood as being fundamentally silent on many constitutional questions. And these silences are only later filled by the constitutional praxis and customs of the state in its entirety, so not just constitutional interpretation by a court. To the extent there is one, the brevity of the written constitution is understood as a virtue rather than a vice. So one of the Danish constitutional theorists writes like with pride that the Danish constitution is not longer than a newspaper article. So the constitution is envisioned as a living being that cannot be separated from societal and political developments. So the parliamentary notion of democracy is political rather than legal, and it's procedural rather than substantive. And the core regulatory principle of this constitutionalism is majoritarianism. And majoritarianism obviously has its limits within this vision of constitutionalism, but these are limits imposed by tradition and constitutional custom, and not a Bill of Rights protected by a constitutional court. Power is concentrated in the executive and legislative branches of government, and the idea of judicial review is sort of viewed on with skepsis. It's seen as sort of a political exercise by the judiciary, which cannot be tolerated by Parliament. Okay. So now to the last one.
Okay.
5 minutes. Okay. Ooh. Okay. So with the fall of communism, a radical political, economic, and social transformation was put in motion in Central and Eastern Europe. And a central part of this transformation was the adoption of liberal democratic constitutions that in many ways resemble the post-fascist constitution. So they also stress protection of fundamental rights, rule of law, free press, private property, and strong constitutional courts. They represent a complete symbolic break with the past, with the totalitarian past, removes all references to the previous regime. And 1989, like the Second World War had been, becomes this sort of radical new beginning. Something entirely new is put in motion. But that being said, in other respects, the post-communist constitutions are fundamentally different from the post-fascist constitutions. And for that reason, I've chosen to treat them as an independent ideal type. So they have a very different genesis than the post-fascist constitutions. Post-fascist constitutions are elite constructions. Parliamentary ones are these evolutionary beings. And the post-communist constitutions are created by roundtable negotiations, ideal typically, which is seen as this new vision of constitution making. The post-communist constitutionalism also think about its totalitarian past in a very different way than the post-communist constitutions do, because within the post-communist constitutional imagination, the totalitarian past was something imposed on the people against their will. It was not something internal. It's not this internal collapse of the legal and political order. The communist and communism, whether this reflects political realities or not, were seen as them and not us. So for that reason, post-communist constitutionalism and this imagination does not have the fear of the people or the nation as its founding myth. I would say, on the contrary, it's founded on the notion of the liberation of the people from its foreign oppressors. It's sort of this joyful return of political freedom, understood in terms of national self-determination. So at its heart, post-communist constitutional imagination celebrate what is arguably feared most by the post-fascist constitutional imagination, which is nationalism, the nation state, and national sovereignty. Because democracy means national democracy within this kind of imagination. So whereas the post-communist constitution, the constitution making, the roundtable negotiations have been described as being post-sovereign by many scholars, there's really nothing post-sovereign about the political worlds they create. On the contrary, most post-communist constitutions had strong and explicit protections of national unity, independence, and sovereignty of the state. So in many ways, this sort of marks the return of ethno-nationalism to the European constitutional imagination. And I can see that I'm probably running out of time now. Oh, okay, so this is only the first part of my paper. So the second part of my paper, I'm just going to sketch out what it's about. It's saying basically, okay, now I've sketched out these ideal types sort of as if they were completely divorced from the European project. But really, that's not possible to do that. We have to tell the story as integral to one another. And in the second part of the paper, so what I want to do in my postdoctoral research is basically looking at how these different kinds of imagination shape how the different member states think about what the EU is, think about EU authority, think about their own relationship to the European project, their own member statehood. And I try to sketch that out in the second part of my paper. Overall, I think only one of these three ideal types, the parliamentary ones, does not actively think about its relationship to the EU. They have this sort of idea that they are completely separate, but the others have a very sort of reflexive understanding of their relationship to the European project. But I can speak to that maybe in the Q&A, because I'm out of time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Michael, and then Luke and Agustin. Paul and you. Okay. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Signe. Great presentation. I think I quibble about the three. I think there are four. I don't think the Greek, Portuguese, and Spanish cases are the same. Mm-hmm. Partly because, as you put it, the post-fascist fear is a fear of the internal collapse from the myth, because I think it's a myth, but it's a myth that had an important impact, which is the collapse of democracy from itself. So I don't think that particular myth resonates in the context of, particularly if we think about Greece and Portugal, as they move towards the EU, they very much see it as a liberation towards democracy, not as a fear of democracy writ large. So I think there's a separate, but it's a quibble. The question I have is whether you think that the first ideal type, which in some ways I think is the dominant ideal type, through the project of integration tends to override the other two. And that explains, to some extent, the backlash, but also in the British and Scandinavian skepticism towards the project itself. But whether there is a sort of a dynamic here which means that eventually the Model 1 will be the winner in the competition of these ideal types. And if so, why the European project seems to, at least I would have thought, seems to conform to that first ideal type and push the others to one side.
I have 6 questions. So I think I would like to take another question before you answer.
Okay.
And then the next 2, and otherwise I think we will have difficulties making it. Luke.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And I think it's useful because I'm complementing to Michael's point. First, also to express my enthusiasm. I think this is very valuable research. It's also constitutional pluralism in action, and where you really see how important it is to think of member states as a plurality. So I think that is very useful. Now, a minor issue on the quibbling side. In my case, it is about the Benelux. I'm speaking here as a Dutchman living in Belgium, and I was a bit surprised to hear the Benelux countries lumped under the post-fascist constitutions, knowing that they have all lived German occupation as a foreign occupation and not as an internal domestic fascist revolution like in Germany and Italy, knowing also that there are very strong parliamentary systems. And in the case of the Netherlands, that there is not even a constitutional court. Only very late and without real powers. So there's perhaps, they resemble more actually the second type of the parliamentary democracies with a very longer history. And continue a bit, that is not a real question, but thinking out aloud, whether you're also taking into account the difference between republics and monarchies in this respect. It's also striking, of course, that the 3 you mentioned in number 2 plus the 3 Benelux countries are monarchies. Like, which well, I don't quite know what to make of it, but I think it is relevant in terms of conceptualizing the constitution and also the relationship and the fear of the people, because when there's a monarch, that it means that the people is not the only constituent principle, but there's also something else. And along the lines of what Michael was saying, I think, and that's why it's very important that indeed there's a problem, and that's a difference there between the Benelux and the 3 number 2 in the way they can relate to the EU and the Parliamentary. It seems to be a little bit more absolute in the case of the UK, etc. So.
And
I'm not
I think I
ending
will
in a
have
real-
to ask you.
No, I'm not ending in a question. This is just an expression of enthusiasm. So it's very stimulating. So please continue. Thank you.
Thank you. These are both fantastic questions. I think I'll start with your question. So on the point of like republics and constitutional monarchies, I actually addressed that first in my paper, and I can't really help myself because that's sort of I have a training also in classical political theory, and of course these are like ideal types, right? But I don't think they really apply as sort of very important, because it's not a political contested issues from the perspective also of the EU, whether it's monarchies or of republics. And I don't think it says a lot about how they think about democracy ultimately. We could also say Spain is actually also a constitutional monarchy, right? But it clearly has this like post-fascist sort of constitutional imagination. On the point of the Benelux countries, so I have a chapter in my thesis which is about sort of the history of European integration, and specifically sort of what happens after the war, where I look at sort of some of the discussions and ideas expressed by the resistance movements, also in the Netherlands and Belgium, but also in the other original 6. And it is this fear of fascism as an international movement. So it's not really seen as sort of Germany as the enemy, but fascism as the enemy, which is understood as something that can happen anywhere, basically. And I think what is very different from the Benelux experience of the war to the Scandinavian one, so I write a bit about that in the paper also, is then Sweden, of course, was a neutral power and did not experience the horrors of fascism within its own borders. But actually, neither did Denmark really, despite being occupied. So Denmark had a really easy time during the Second World War for different reasons. It didn't experience a legal and political breakdown. They were allowed to carry on with more or less as they did actually before the war. Almost no Dane died. 99% of all Danish Jews were spared. So there's a difference in experience there. But I take your point. I mean, and these are ideal types, and I would definitely agree that they probably. I mean, the main case for the post-fascist constitutions, of course, is Germany, right? I mean, we can all see that that's sort of the clearest expression. So point really well taken. To Mike's point. I mean, originally I did have the Mediterranean enlargements, as you know, also as an ideal type, because many of these ideas are things me and Mike have worked on also earlier. But I think when I started working on them, that it really is not too different from the other ones. I mean, the difference is basically that Franco and Salazar outlived the Second World War, right? But they had the complete breakdown in the interwar period. They just didn't have a radical break after the war. Of course, it's different. There's a difference in how they think about Europe, because both have this like myth of Europe. But the Mediterranean enlargements, they have this idea of the return to Europe, right? Which is sort of like, they have this vision that becoming a part of the EU and the European Convention of Human Rights sort of allows them to go back to the original starting place, like getting on the train they lost, basically, and then sort of catching up to this sort of democratic free world of like human rights and political freedom. To the dominance of type 1, I mean, I completely agree, and maybe I should have stressed that more in the presentation. And I think it's not just sort of the imagination of the original six, but also of the EU, or like the European constitutional imagination. So I think it's a version of what Sommick has called value order constitutionalism, right? And that means that, of course, it's easier for them to integrate into one another because they have the same fundamental understanding of what a constitution is. I think that's like the short answer. If we should have more questions.
Okay. Yeah, there are 4 more questions, and I think like 4 minutes left.
Sorry, I spoke too long.
I'm not taking more questions, and what I'm going to do is I'm asking all the people with questions to pose them now, preferably as briefly as possible, and then you can select what you want to answer afterwards.
Okay.
So first we have Augustine.
2 short points. I don't have time to say it's a very interesting paper, so I have to skip very quickly. But the first question on the making boxes is always difficult. But I think, and there are borderlines and this kind of stuff. But I think you are committing the Muller sin, that is seeing Italy and France through German eyes, for 3 reasons. The constitutions of France and Italy were agreed before the Cold War set in. So the fear of communism was not part of the constitutional process. The second question is that they had, until '58, France, short-lived parliaments, short-lived governments. Why? Because parliament was running the show. If not, the government will be enduring. Italy had a constitutional code coming late. France did not have a constitutional code. And then they did not have regions until very late in the game. So I think they don't fit into this. Moreover, post-fascist is one thing, anti-fascist is another thing. And the French and the Italian constitutions were anti-fascists. And there are very good reasons to be forbidding the fascist party. I don't see why in a democratic constitution you can say it or you can have it implicit. But fascist parties are not allowed. Period. It's not militant democracy. You cannot have fascists. That's it. And the second question, they should be outlawed.
The theory says it all.
No, sorry, they cannot be. If you are saying that I will exterminate you, this is not an argument. This is an action. There are two different things. It's a criminal action. The other thing is that implicitly in your argument is that you are not giving a space for a democratic constitution to be valuable. Because at the end of the day, my impression is that you put your bets on the evolutionary constitutionalism, which is not without problems.
Why do you think I do that? Because I'm a Dane?
Not because you are a Dane, but the implicit, the two models, the post-fascist and the post-communist, are not essentially ones in which democracy flourishes. It's the models in which democracy is constrained. But can there not be a democratic constitution and democracy flourish? Was democracy flourishing under Margaret Thatcher? Were not the UK missing having a constitution when Margaret Thatcher came to power?
Right. Counter 88.
Jiri.
Yeah. I will
And
do
then
your
Paul.
bit. It was a very interesting, very good paper. I enjoyed it thoroughly, and I like your methodology because you distinguish between imaginaries, imagination. We can have many different theoretical imaginations, but these are imaginaries affecting the way we think about constitutions on daily basis and the meaning we ascribe them. And I particularly liked how you brought post-communism in, because it's so important, and you did an amazing job, and I only wonder whether there are two subtypes in post-communism.
Okay.
Sub-ideal types, which is one which is more transformational, slow, transform Poland, Hungary, and the other which is more revolutionary, which is the Czechoslovakia, where you have more risks of revolutionary constitutionalism leading to the split of the country. But at the same time, you have more constitutional constraints. As Wojciech Sadurski would argue, Czech Republic, the only country with complex jurisprudence of the Constitutional Court, and the only country with a material substance of democratic constitutionalism incorporated into case law of the Constitutional Court. So I wonder if actually the revolutionary constitutionalism can play, paradoxically, conservative role that Arendt was talking about in consequence.
Paul is the last. Marco is withdrawn.
I'll be super brief. Thank you. Fantastic paper. Also had a bit of trouble. I was thinking about Netherlands too, and also Ireland is a good example. But we can go on and on. You know, you have classical political theory background, you said. Then I'm wondering, what about religion? Because, I mean, essentially those three countries you are putting in category 2 are Protestant countries. And I think most of their constitutional vocabulary is not a 20th century thing. It's something which has a far longer history, and essentially was created in a backlash against the Pope and against the Emperor and whatever, all the way up. And I think it's very difficult to reconstruct. I think you're overemphasizing the impact of, say, fascism in the bad stuff in the 20th century, because there is, in the sense, a far longer trajectory. And I think in all three of them, actually, but especially, I would say, into one where you stress yourself, the continuity, and that's basically because it's embedded and drawn from a religious vocabulary of Protestantism.
So maybe to have a typology, you could be post-Catholic constitution.
Yeah.
Okay.
Post-fascist and post-Catholic. Yeah.
You have to handle all these complexities.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for all these questions. I mean, it's so helpful right now because it's still at such an early stage. So I really appreciate it. I don't know whether it even makes sense for me to start to try to respond, but I just really want to thank you because it will help me to sort of move the project forward, I think.